Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive, said author Howard Thurman. Welcome to the second season of the Vulnerable Power Show. Heart-to-heart, unscripted dialogues with world leaders who are shining examples of the unfolding leadership ascension. Hear from these creative leaders and visionary entrepreneurs who have traversed deep leadership transformations and inner alchemy, actualizing their vision for a better world. We share raw insights and practical tips so you too can transform painful experiences and old energies as fuel for your leadership growth and collective good. Join us and listen in so we can all bring hope, inspire transformation, uplift the world, and show what is possible through heart-centered, vulnerable leadership. As Margaret Mead, anthropologist, once said, "Never believe that a few caring people can't change the world. For indeed, that's all who ever have." Greetings, everybody. Greetings and welcome back to another episode of the Vulnerable Power Show. A deep dive, a raw, immersive experience into the heart of leadership. Here, we highlight and spotlight the future paradigm of leadership. Those that have done the inner transformative work to step into their calling and to bring forth not only what they feel is their vision for the planet, collective impact and collective change. As always, I'm Haas Sadeghi. If you've never experienced the show before, welcome. You can always go back on the YouTube channel. This is the second season. There's a whole first season. My intention to inspire you, encourage you, and empower you through our episodes. So wherever you are at in your leadership journey, you can be equipped with the tools and wisdom to do what you need to do. As always, I love to start with how I've met the guest. And today we have a treat and a sheer enjoyment to have on a very close confidant and co-creator and friend, Manya Welch. Manya and I reconnected, shall we say, because we probably have known each other in a more kismet, greater fashion a few years ago, actually 2 years ago, almost coming up to be precise, through a networking platform. And while this may have been LinkedIn, she posted about the metaphysical and the higher realms, having invoked an intention to bring about greater vibrational embodiment and to meet more universal guidance or guidance from her guides. And she literally posted about this, and the guide she had met in this meditative experience was somebody near and dear to me, or an energy archetype, shall we say, near and dear to me. So we connected, and I gotta say, on a very personal, raw note, as I love to also embody the mission of the show and embody this heart-centered, vulnerable leadership, that we met under very unique circumstances where I personally had been coming off the tail end of this sabbatical pilgrimage process of really deep excavation. And so without going on and on, what it led me to was feeling like I had really lost and given up on my soul essence, was really not able to find tribe, so to speak, that were of a similar resonance. And what I got to experience with a couple of connections last year, a handful of connections, Manya and I's being one of them at the start of this pandemic that shifted and ties to greater collective changes, which we're going to talk about today on the show, probably later in the episode. And really what it did for me is it showed me that we have a novel opportunity during this time to not only blaze a new path, to really live embodied in our purpose and to bring down what we're really here to do and to connect with resonant souls over this shared purpose. So I really feel our paths converge because we have a similar mission, and it's one that we're going to talk about later in this show because we have already co-created together on many ventures, and really excited to have you. I can go on and on and on. So without further ado, Manya, thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to, as always, share yourself and share in a raw and vulnerable way. So how you doing today? And let's dive in.
Thank you for that wonderful intro. I'm very honored to be on your show. I love the show. I've obviously seen your previous episodes. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm feeling a little nervous. I'm feeling motivated, and I'm also feeling inspired to share my journey with the intention that it will inspire and support others on theirs.
That's awesome. Yeah, you're all a very intentional and conscious leader and a really amazing artist. And I'm excited to unpack really the clarity that you've had recently, which we're going to get to in terms of spotlighting how your transformation has shaped you. And please know that the resonance is really mutual. So, if you were to start, as the audience, if you're new to the show, we go very improvised, and the nervous share. Thank you. I mean, we do open up space, as I call it, before we hit record. And there's usually a very intentional little primer that I do with the guests. And in our case, before we hit record, we could sense the energy and it was palpable. So I share your resonance. So where would you like to start us? Where would you like to take us on this voyage? And in terms of what I would encapsulate as like the before and after of your metamorphosis, because I think for you, creativity is a big thing. We're going to really infuse today in the show, because I know you really well, and I'm excited for you to share more of what I don't know about your personal story and how creativity and art in particular as a medium has unlocked your leadership ascension journey. So before we get to all that good stuff and the technologies that you and I have been working on and co-creating and sharing ideas on, take us through how you would describe your metamorphosis and kind of where you were at before as a leader.
Okay, so I think it's going to be easy to start with the artistic side, because that's been one of the key components in my transformation. So it was, where that came from, to then how that is a factor of what I'm doing now. So obviously what I'm doing now incorporates art, and it's also become more than that. So from the very beginning, art played a significant part in my life because I was an only child. And as an only child, I would also learn to effectively entertain myself. And I would do that through imagination, and I would do that through reading a lot. And I was also doing that through art. And it was one of my pastimes, and it was also one of my hobbies. And that has stayed with me throughout my life. What became more apparent later on in my life was where I'd been using it to disassociate and to escape from reality. And that was then one of the aspects I then had to look at as to how effective you can use art if you actually fully embody it. And then that leads to obviously what I'm doing now in the Creative Alchemy sort of circle. So art was significant even back then. And even as a child, I was always had this awareness that there was always more out there than what I'd been told. It was very easy for me to believe in my imagination and to believe in things that I had outgrown, because I didn't always need to see it in my present senses to believe it existed. And so that also contributed a little bit to my social awkwardness. So then as a result, I kind of went more introverted or withdrawn, because I realized that I wasn't really connecting with my peers because of how I was thinking and how I would perceive things. So there was kind of a lot of other dimensional layers going on, even in my childhood. And a lot of this I didn't start unpacking until I'd hit my mid-20s. And then I started to really see how I hadn't dealt with some things that had come up in my childhood, such as abandonment. And I'd been ignoring things so much that actually in my early 20s, I actually went through behavior patterns of disassociating even more. And that was through alcohol and through sort of drugs, certainly not to the extent that other people's journey may have taken them. There was an aspect of that. And that was why I had been doing it. And I had to look at my behavior patterns and where those had come from. And then I started to understand a little bit more about conditioned behavior and how I'd learned behavior as a coping mechanism. And then as we kind of go further on, I returned back to art, and I returned back to wanting to be involved in the educational system creatively, until I realized that the system was actually stifling creativity. And I had experiences then, as I had tried a few times to train as a teacher in the system, until I realized that that wasn't suited to where I wanted to take the creativity and the importance of it. It was not going to work in a very 3D matrix system. And so a few times, just at the point I was going to qualify, I quit. And I would make these decisions, and quite often I wouldn't be explaining or telling people along the way. So they always seemed very instant, and and I would take a different route and change my direction very quickly.
Well, let's unpack that, because this is some good stuff already and something that dropped in right there. I think that parallels, I think, the way you process, because you and I, it's definitely shown up. This nervous energy, as you talked about it. I used to be socially awkward, to use your words. And as we've talked about, you're pretty much a pretty, what I would say, hardcore, to use a colloquial millennial terminology from America, pretty introverted. And I'm very extroverted, and it's shown up. Oftentimes we've had to learn how to harmonize, as you and I know, so to speak, behind the scenes, as we've developed co-creative synergy. So can you talk about that for a second, what it's meant? Because you do talk about this as it affected you growing up. And then I sense and hunch and have a hypothesis that the way you process, because I know this stuff, given my background and training, and we've talked about it in a transformational nature, that most introverts process internally, if you don't know, internally, and then externally, extroverts, you can see it's very transparent, because I process out loud. I'm thinking out loud, so to speak, as I call it. So can you walk us through that? Because I know I've mentioned to you Susan Cain's book, shout out to Susan, and the book Quiet, and it's about introverted leadership, and there's probably other authors that talk about that. So can you talk from your experience? Because there's a couple of things I want to unpack, and we'll move to imagination and escapism next. What did that look like for you? Because I sense that's why people couldn't read in your head, because you were doing these choices internally as an introvert will. So Can you talk to us overarchingly and then break it down however it feels inspired? What has it been like to be an introverted leader? And then correlate this.
Being an introverted leader certainly has its advantages, and then it's the learning of understanding not all people operate in that way. So it's important to also formulate into words and bring it out into form, which was one of the learnings. As an introvert, so I would have what I would find, the way that I communicated with other people would be actually more telepathic. I'd half say the sentence, and then I would make this assumption they'd picked up the energy of what I meant and intended, and they would also fill in the blanks of the pieces that I decided were not necessarily relevant, because I could convey it energetically. And I had to learn that not all people were receptive to nonverbal cues or communication. And so that was things that would play out fairly regularly in the friendships that I would form. So if you were to put me in a big group of people, what would happen is I could form very meaningful one-to-one connections with people. In a group, I would become more of the observer or the watcher, and I would be overstimulated with the environment, because I'd be picking up the energies of other people. And I would also be picking up all the nonverbal communication cues between. And then I would be discerning if I had anything to offer or whether I would hold back, depending on how I felt the other person's receptivity may be. And by doing that, I potentially crossed wires at times, because people weren't not understanding me fully. And then once you start being labeled certain things by society as either being a little bit weird or quirky, as an introvert, you're likely to get more introverted, because it appears nobody's understanding. Obviously, what I realized as I went on.
We get you. We see you. If you're watching, by the way, we see you, introverts. All right, keep going.
Yeah. So what I learned along the way was how other people received differently. And what I feel is that actually the path that was laid out for me, which is when the art kind of wove together with the teaching role, because I also really enjoyed teaching. So it was almost as if that supported me then being able to stand up in front of people in the leadership capacity and to run workshops and to communicate. And when I'd had time to fully process and have give that thought to how to convey the information I wanted to convey in the subject matters that I was talking about, I would have a lot of flow, and it would come through very organically, and I would have that connection. So from a professional way, I was able to see how I implemented it. And my learning was really how to take that and implement it in personal relational dynamics.
Okay, so like let's unpack that also a little bit further, because this is good, because I've had so much experience with introverts, and I think it's such an energetic principle for me that you attract the contrast to grow and to learn. So I probably have become more patient and to use different psychometrics or tools like Myers-Briggs that we've talked about. There is this essence of you can't really connect if you don't understand one another. Intimacy is impacted. So talk to us about that, because you really synchronistically dovetail to then your personal life, because that's where I think then, professionally, great, kudos to you. And if you're watching, she's, giving you some examples that you can maybe will inspire you. Yeah.
There's one example I can give professionally, which would really highlight this too.
And then let's go to that intimate, personal. How did the introverted extrasensitivity show up there? Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So obviously I'd mentioned in my earlier life that I was sort of more socially awkward when it came to making friends. And certainly my secondary school experience, which I believe you call high school in the States, had a lot of pain to it. I wasn't very popular, and I was the butt of every joke. I had a very small select few of people who were prepared to be friends with me because I was so unpopular. And at this point, all the girls wanted to obviously, mix with the boys. And so there was a lot of, I was kind of shunned aside almost, like other people didn't want to associate with me because I was embarrassing in some way. And this was the secondary school experience. So these were both teenagers. So along my professional career, one of the jobs that I had, which to this day is one of the best jobs that I really has left, like it's really close to my heart, was when I got a job in a pupil referral unit in Liverpool. So a pupil referral unit, if you're not familiar in the States with them, in the UK we have them. When you're expelled from school because of behavioural issues, you then have to go to like a little centre, which will then work with you in order to then place you in another school, especially if you're still within the age requirements where you have to attend full-time education. So these students would come here. So we're talking about the very people that would have bullied me at a secondary school. I ended up tutoring these, and they were boys predominantly. I worked with boys, and it was interesting because I approached them as if they were their own person, and they would share with me because I would be very interested as to what had resulted them to behave the way that they did. And I was genuinely interested, and I was engaged, and I would listen. And there was a lot of respect that I had of these students. And in order to engage them into future thinking, I actually was at that time, without realizing it, doing a lot of creative alchemy work with them. And at that time, I hadn't actually given it a term. And I became known as the art teacher within the unit, and all the other students in the other classes wanted to come into mine for that reason, because we're talking about students that were not academically inclined, that struggled with a very authoritative sort of system, that weren't listened to. And so when they came to me, I pretty much did the opposite almost. And then it really supported how they then went forward. And I asked them to think about their future as well. And it was like visualization without realizing. And then a lot of the things I did was also practically creative based.
It's interesting. Yes. So we would call that almost sounds like the juvenile or delinquent system when you're underage here. Yeah. And I find that fascinating because I, as you know, I've known you for a while, that, you're caught in a situation where you're teaching your bullies, and you highlight a point that I sense is going to reverberate later in your narrative. So that's interesting. And because earlier you did mention something in terms of, and I know let's continue down how this showed up for you personally. And I know it's going to kind of dovetail more of your personal transformation, which we're going to talk about. You did mention something before we continue on this introverted point, because I think that there's two elements, and the psychological sciences and the human understanding and the ontological learning as a species, we're catching up to a lot of this. And for me, as you know, as I said earlier, I think I've attracted it in for me to become more well-rounded as a leader, to have an appreciation. I think this is the age we're in of synthesizing, bringing, and I do a lot of teamwork, as you know, you got to bring all these elements together. So I say this to say I have a respect for differences now where I wouldn't have, and maybe it's my mediation training. And I think you're touching on another element that the science is bringing out. It's one thing to be an introvert versus an extrovert, so to speak, or distinguishing the two. And it's another to also be highly sensitive, as I've talked about in other episodes, or I don't like that term as much, extrasensory, because when you talk about telekinetic, I think now the science community is verifying some of this out of like heart math, that you have this morphogenic field, and we exchange, everything is energy. When we connect, we bond. And then what may have been in the mystical communities, telepathy, telekinetic abilities, I think there's another element. Would you agree that I find you and I are both extrasensory? So I think that's probably another element to clarify for the audience. I would distinguish you, not to put labels, to give frames of reference for everybody in the audience, because as Manya alluded to, we can fall into boxes and labels. It's this notion of really highlighting that you can process like an introvert and also have extrasensory or highly sensitive HSP gifts, which then makes it two variables that coincide.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Because I think you're gifted, and that's part of why you can do what you can do. So others may look up to you in that way, like I kind of do, and say, hey, you have gifts that I don't have because of those extrasensory natures. So with that being said, let's infuse these two together. Say, because you are an introvert and because you're extrasensory, again, so thank you for the professional. How did that show up then? Talk to us about the personal life. Before, there's a couple of other things I want to unpack, like imagination, and then you talk about escapism and embodied art. So I want to unpack some more of those. Let's finish this introverted concept.
I feel that the introverted nature and also the the hypersensitivity aspect contributed somewhat to my lack of assertiveness in relational dynamics. So I did become a slight homing beacon for narcissistical partners, and that was earlier on as well. And I feel that was because I was disassociated and disembodied. Like, I didn't know a healthy way to convey an emotional response that was intense, like anger or frustration. So I would take those inward, because I was also more wired to want to be in a harmonious environment. And the introverted nature of me would actually recoil from any tensions when there was any disharmony, and I wouldn't want to rock the boat. And this played out in my personal life until it got to a point where, because I hadn't been identifying or looking at that part of me for as long as I had been, it all came to a head in a very very epic way that even I was blindsided, and I would never have predicted it. And this kind of relates to my marriage and the relational dynamics that then played out within my marriage.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like what is emerging as a theme for you is this notion of asserting your power, dealing with tension. And it's funny that you and I gravitated and met each other the way we did and have a tight bond like we do, because those that don't know my background, because on this show I allude to it, and we have had an episode on my legal background. I have a master's in dispute resolution from a very top institute that was literally all about holistic conflict resolution, which was both transpersonal, interpersonal, organizational. And so I was very much coming from a different background of being conflict adverse. Being conflict prone and going towards it. And I think that also speaks to not only my industry, my craft that I was trained in, also this notion of extroverts tend to not mind this, you called it friction. I guess you could say the byproduct of meeting new people, the byproduct of synergy is friction, right? You got to kind of rub up against one another, and you got to get close, which maybe we can unpack, which is more what I call relational alchemy. So anyways, So talk to us about this notion of imagination, because I know we're going to talk more about how in your story and your growth and metamorphosis, your marriage and the divorce and all that has been very seminal. So we'll get to that. I want to unpack a few more feathers that I put in the cap. So imagination, you talk about this, and I know on a more technical level, I've learned a lot about this from you, because I used to be very much one of those hardcore left hemisphere people, trained in law, made it worse, pre-med before that, as you know, and the audience may or may not know. So I was one of those people in the metaphysical community, in the mystical community, in the meditation community, that when you would do visualizations, it'd be like, I don't see anything, I can't think it. It's, so what is this? And I've learned a lot about this from you, because you helped me parcel through and get more clear, because these are, as science is showing us, basically mechanisms, and ancient mystical traditions talked about it, as you and I know. So what do you mean by imagination? Talk to us from, and I know we're jumping ahead a little bit, previewing Creative Alchemy. What does imagination mean to you? And explain it to us for the audience's sake, as technical as you can, as an artist, as a creative alchemist. Yeah.
So, well, imagination is now become one of the pillars within the creative alchemy process that I have now obviously burst through and am implementing in what I'm doing at this time. Now, if I would go way back into, say, how imagination plays out in children, obviously everyone's familiar with, children have imaginary friends, or they see things that aren't there. And society as a general will be, fairly dismissive of that. And when I started to really understand what imagination is, and if you were to define it as is in the dictionary, it will say that it's a new idea, a new concept, or a new method that is created outside of the present senses. So imagination as a word does not mean it's fantastical. Everything around us has come from an imagination. Somebody has imagined it, it then became a visualization, and then it became put into form and transformed into reality, where we can then sort of touch it. And then when we look in even the quantum field, and obviously you mentioned and hinted a little bit at the sciences, which isn't my forte, and there is a lot more information scientifically out there, we start understanding energy. So imagination is basically the spark of that creative energy. And in how I deliver that, that's where it comes from, the heart. And it shows up all the limitations of imagination that is in existence for others. It shows up, especially if you ask somebody what would they like to experience more of in their life. They may say, I wouldn't experience more abundance, or I'd like to have a holiday, or whatever it is they would want. However, when they feel into how to get it, they will limit themselves by what is already in existence. So if I need more money, I need to have more clients, or I need to charge higher prices, okay? Because they're mentalizing straight away for a solution to reach this outcome. And that is creating within limitations. That's creating from what is already existing. So the idea of imagination is it's creating something that is not around us. It's surrendering almost to the how it may come about. And then this then leads into, the manifestation energy, which is all creative flow. And that's all aspects of basically what I'm doing now is supporting this flow so that it will lead to creating more of what people are wanting to experience, which is more of the good stuff in their life.
So it sounds like it's an inner faculty then, is what you're talking about. It's almost like inner mechanisms. And I know from personal experience, because I teach inner energetic systems and more advanced, and we're probably going to maybe touch on it. Depends on how much time we have to go too deep into it. Of course, the audience can always catch some of the stuff we're co-creating and putting out individually and together. So it sounds like this concept of imagination and creativity are hand in hand, and I know you're going to talk probably more about it. You talked about this earlier, the system of education and creativity, without getting too much into the politics or the policy aspects of it, because I know you're a teacher in form. What did you see as problems? Because I actually have a lot of colleagues in the educational, academic, and policy space that are in my network. So we'll include this because I like how it organically came up. And I think, this speaks to Steve Jobs, and many others, Silicon Valley, which I introduced you to that show recently. And this TV show from America, where one of the characters even in there opines drop out of college, universities, don't help. No offense to any of the traditional institutions. What we're talking about is, part of the theme of the show, there's a paradigm shift going on, new earth, things like that. How do we transform the educational system to embrace creativity. So how do you see it? I'll do it as this prompt. I'll hone it in.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see the educational system is currently stifling creativity? And what how did you see that from your personal experience? Because you touched upon that earlier.
Yeah. So when I mean, this was a few years back. I certainly think it's come a long way since. I do still feel like that there is an aspect that still remains within the education system. And I can only obviously talk about my experience in the UK. When I was doing teacher training, and this was following on from this experience of working with these students in the pupil referral unit, that really inspired me to train as a secondary school art teacher, to actually go into the system and be an art teacher in that role. When I was doing my teacher training, although I enjoyed the subject and I enjoyed working with these teenagers, I actually had more of a problem with the staff and the head. So in the UK, it's very important to get league tables and stats. So it's all about the numbers to highlight that school, and everyone is competing. So the nature, and this also reflects on funding that they will be getting. So straight away, we see that it's no longer about the pupils as much as the stats and the league tables of where this school will appear. So we have, like an overriding body that oversees school regulations and how they are delivering to the students. And it's called Ofsted. It's like this kind of big board, and they go and, go into the schools and do a report and assessment. And then they make recommendations. And so everyone is trying to get to the excellent, grading. And that gets advertised everywhere for all the schools. So this particular school I was in was one of the schools that was in an underdeprived area. And their performance was always slightly below par, which means that when they had a result, they would very much try to implement a suggestion. And that's where I felt they took it too far. So one of the things that had been said to them by Ofsted was, your students have very little awareness of where they are graded at the moment and what they need to be achieving to improve their own performance. So the school then decided that they would print out a label, like a little sticky label, that would tell the student where they were at, where they had to get to. And this label would then be on the front of their books. So all their peers could then see. And I was like, hang on a minute, you're going to create a very uncomfortable environment for students whose grade is slightly lower than their peers. And you're going to present that so everybody can see. This isn't something, all their friends are going to look. And then if they are not performing as high in that subject, you are going to affect their confidence in it. And my art mentor, who was the teacher and I was mentoring, she was my mentor, I was under her. She said to me, I agree with what you're saying. This has come from the head teacher. This is what we have to do. We can't argue with this or discuss it. And I said, this doesn't make any sense, because this isn't going to help the confidence of the students. They're going to compare each other. Their morale is going to drop. I don't feel like this is the right way to handle that. Surely we could take them aside and you can talk to them about where they're at, and it can be done in confidence. I'm not, and it seems so obvious. I'm like, you're literally labeling somebody and you are creating a limitation on their ability as well. This isn't a good environment for people to blossom in. And I realized at this point that if I was to carry on in this system, because I wouldn't be agreeing with it, the chances of me being able to be effective may be limiting for me, because I would be against this backlash of lots of other people there. And it didn't feel right to pursue that direction. I knew I wanted to go into teaching or to training. It felt like that would not be the environment to do it in. So actually, I ended up doing what I did, which was another direction, which was of huge benefit to me with the job then I did after that, which is when I worked with the local government training IT for lots of other reasons, because I realized I was training adults, had this huge fear up until that point of actually training in front of an adult audience. So again, I put myself in a situation to combat a specific fear, and that opened up. And IT in itself, this is something that when I went into IT training, I knew nothing about technology, and it actually became a subject at school after I had left. So I was at that age where I even missed any formal IT training. And here I am training the finance system for local government. And there is something to fake it till you make it, which is what I had to do. And I became the lead finance trainer. I became good at it, not because I understood the system side or even the finances. I'm training end users. I can relate to the people who had to use the technology because I couldn't do it. So it enabled me to, when I had processed how to do it, I could make it very relatable to people who were equally in that same position. And it's a very visual subject. And then that comes back to the visual arts, you know, and other things.
Imagination and all that. Well, this is, yeah, certainly putting a lot of things into nice little packages for us, because for what I'm hearing, and on a pure energetic level, right, from pure energy likes to expand, energy likes to flow. So I could see how labels, you know, putting it on the book of the child will limit, will constrict, will curtail their expansion of both their awareness, their consciousness, possibilities, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and then you talk about fear and adults training. So I definitely can see how that, so then sounds like creativity from a mechanical perspective is about optimizing and expanding out the power. And I love what you said, because I think there's great application of this in work. And I've seen it myself being more in the business to business space in organizations. Now we're seeing the HR culture, we're seeing a lot of employee engagement go in that direction. And I think this brings us full circle back to introverts and extroverts, because I know to appreciate these differences and you have to assemble different elements. So I think a lot of introverts would be part of this category of creative geniuses, that they don't appreciate that they are creative geniuses because they're misunderstanding themselves, because society has either mislabeled them, outcast them, or whatnot. And I think this goes back to that TV show Silicon Valley and the creative geniuses. I mean, you probably would have fit in really well had you been born in San Francisco, given your generation, because you're similar in age to me, Manya, because I think that show epitomizes it, Silicon Valley. You certainly saw it with Steve Jobs. I think Bill Gates, a lot of them were college dropouts in America. They started these fabulous creative ideas. And I think that goes back to imagination. You have to bring in novelty. You can't do it the way that was. And I think that's more of the science to round out what you said. So I love that. And then you talked about this implicit competition. I think that's important too, to touch upon that. I think there's a TV show, sorry to be so pop culture referencing, that talked about being a stats junkie. And in America, I think Western culture and corporate culture, definitely, and in academia, because it's taken on more of a business undertone. We need to perform better than that institution. And it's become implicit competition based on data, which also stifles creativity, as we know. So that's beautiful, because I think you've put a lot out there for the viewers already. So talk to me about this notion. So we're touching on introverts, extrasensory. Why, for the audience's sake, if you're new to watching this show, which thank you for being here, why do we talk about the personal stuff? Why do we bring up, outside of to show examples, inspire you, give tools and tips? Because, you know, everything's energy, the ecosystem, the organization. If you're a spiritual entrepreneur, like Manya would consider herself, your business, your ecosystem, the teams you're going to build are going to be an energetic extension of that. And so how we show up in our personal lives shapes our professional, which in turn impacts the ecosystems we lead. So if you're like, why are we exploring this as far as leadership? That's why. So talk to me about the escapism, which correlates to ignoring, coping, words you used earlier, about 30 or so minutes ago. So talk to me about that in this relation to embodied art, because that's fascinating when you bring those two words together the way you did. So as best as you can, couch it, this concept of you discovered your art could be used for embodiment. Give us the before. What do you mean by you actually used art to escape or cope, or et cetera? So talk to us about that.
So I feel that my relationship towards artistic practices and why I did them definitely shifted a little bit when I was in my marriage. So this was when we end up having a lot of roles to play. So I was married and I had young children. My art was something that was me. So if I was to strip back all the hats that I was wearing, the underlying essence was this kind of creativity aspect and my art. Now, within my marriage and that dynamic, I stepped more into my art, and I was doing it as a way to connect, which is where also I was energizing myself and motivating myself, which then led to the energy needed to, in effect, cope with the busyness of the day. And then I would top myself up with, being creative, where again I would connect and I would receive that flow. What I was doing was utilizing it in a way where actually I was escaping from my reality so that I could then connect elsewhere to get some energy. And I wasn't addressing the root causes of why I was so depleted and what was really happening, because I wasn't embodied, and therefore I stifled my own creative flow. So although I could then intentionally co-create and create some experiences that I wanted, and this is talking about manifestations, they weren't sticking, or it wasn't holding, because I was ignoring like the root cause. And then I had like this amazing session and this amazing deep dive from somebody called Hasadeki. I don't know if you know him, which then really allowed me to see things that I had not been looking at. And at that point, I really understood when I was using art for escaping and how it was actually not allowing me to fully embody the power of the creative flow. When I started to realize that there is this significance of being embodied, okay, so that the energy can then be transfigured and transformed into something external, I started to become aware of all my own blocks that I had, things that I was not looking at. So the energy was not almost coming fully all the way down because I was blocking it, because I had things that I hadn't been looking at. I hadn't fully identified my disassociation. I had been ignoring my own shadow. I hadn't seen and looked at the ways that I had been looping in certain situations, so there was a lot then that came through as a result. And then that realization that, okay, when art is used for escapism and you are blocking creative flow, and this doesn't even only mean the visual art sense either, when you are stifling your own creative flow because you are disassociated, because you are not embodied, and addressing root causes, then you are restricting your ability to fully create from the imagination, which means that there are all possibilities everywhere. It's almost as if the energy can only go so far and it won't go all the way through.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I know, we'll maybe get a chance to talk more of the quantum mechanics and the 0 point field and things like that. And beautifully said, because you touch upon themes that are regularly touched upon, or in the various show theme episodes that we have on the Vulnerable Power Show. So yeah, it's interesting because also on a mechanical level, so it sounds like you can't be creative if you're leaking energy. So, and I know we oftentimes use the common escapism or coping mechanisms can be drugs, alcohol, sex. And it's, I think the first time I'd ever heard somebody say, I used art, and I would say and venture to say that it's probably more prevalent in the introverted community, which is why I hadn't heard about it. And so I like this because then you also go on to talk about, it sounds like, okay, so if you're leaking energy, it makes sense to me as an energy alchemist and understanding both the science and the metaphysics. So then you can't leak energy and be creative. Then it sounds like you also need to be able to cultivate energy to be creative, which you alluded to, depletion, which correlates to burnout and all that. And then it also sounds on another level, so it seems like there's stepping stones or almost like ascension levels to this, which I know to be the case in what I do, which overlaps. It sounds like then you also need to harness the creative flow and then amplify it and open these channels for creativity. Yeah. So I think that's going to tee us up perfectly down the line on what you do now. So this is beautiful. So how did you address So you did allude to, and thank you for the shout out. You did allude to some of that stuff. How did you address it and implement the changes to be more embodied with the art and not to get let me put it this way, lost in the art, right? And be introverted and kind of go into your own little fairyland. So as you put it very astutely, you don't have to deal with the junk, the blockages, the things we're housing in the body, which is the healing, trauma-informed stuff that we've talked about on the show. So yeah, so how did you make that shift? How did you alchemize that holy cow? Which I guess, let me put it another way and stop blabbering. The issue is never the issue. It's how we relate to the issue that's the issue. So it was never about the art. It was your relationship to how you're using the art. So how did you shift that relationship to the art?
I had to go through the experience of the dark night of the soul.
Ooh, you're speaking my lingo. Elaborate. What are you talking about?
Because I wasn't going to be able to effectively cultivate or harness that energy unless I had started to see what I needed to see. And I created a sequence of events that even I, in my conscious self, would never have ever dreamt up. And this was when I went through separating from my husband. So obviously within a marriage, marriages do break down, and you can end up like sort of going,
shit happens, as they say in America.
And at that point, it was always my husband, he'd been my best friend for many years, and there had been a lot of love in our space. And so, yes, we had drifted apart. The sequence of events that followed when I said, I feel we needed to have separate, or at least have a break, was something that I was so blindsided about with what ended up happening. That was really when I started to, have to look at myself and like how did I miss something? What was it showing me? Because it was a reflection of what I hadn't owned myself. And so I had to really go through a lot of immense pain, which nobody would intentionally create. Sometimes that destruction is needed before you can birth through something else. And depending how much you had been creating in avoidance or in a disassociated state, then is dependent on how much you need to end up dissolving away and to release, so that there is the room to rebirth and become anew. And so there was a lot of stripping back. So, in my experience that I had kind of created, there was gaslighting that had happened at the point of me separating, and, the behaviors that my husband was doing. And I was not, I hadn't seen that coming, because I had been in such disassociated state from my own shadow that I was also ignoring what was right in front of me. And because I didn't like conflict, then I was all trying to create harmony, or I felt like I was. I mean, obviously I also played a part in this, in the dynamic that unfolded. My intention was to try and harmonize or rise above it. And that was, again, avoiding what I really needed to see in what was happening within our space. I don't feel that without that experience, I would have then either seen or fully stepped in. And obviously, a lot of that came from me surrendering to being fully activated, to fully see who I was and to actually address the things that I had been too scared to look at potentially. And obviously, the support from, master teacher helped me to see that within. Once that was within, and I kind of was processing and integrating that, layers started to come off where I started to see things differently. And then the sequence of events that happened, they blindsided me, confused me, hurt me a lot. And I, once I had processed, I could then start creating more of what I wanted. I couldn't do that until I had or destroyed the inner work that was there, the disassociation. I had to deal with all that, strip away my ego. And that's really what had to dissolve. I had to strip all that away.
So it's like garbage in, garbage out. Yeah, it's one of the things I admire about you, is that you have, and I have a lot of respect, because a lot of people have to unlearn that it's all within. A lot of mystical traditions, it's all an inside game. We've talked about this ad nauseum on the show. One of the I guess you could say, seeds of creative inspiration that flow through to create this platform and go, hey, I'm gonna do the Vulnerable Power Show, dropped in, as you know. So yeah, I think there's great beauty in what you said, because so it seemed like I said, you would get lost in the art, and then I love what you'd said, you had to face the pain, and I like how you face the pain in what I would call through the beauty way, and through the art. So then how did it shift for you? So before you continue on, because I think this dovetails in your personal dynamics, which, if I know you personally, has shaped your leadership style, which we alluded to earlier. I'm an extrovert. Extroverts have no problem with conflict. Probably why I got attracted to being a lawyer, being a mediator, and then having to learn, as Carl Jung and some of these other transformative leaders have said before me, that you got to kind of mold. If you're an introvert, you want to kind of adapt and harmonize your extrovert. Reality is about unifying these polarities, harmonizing, balancing. So I could see how for me it would be easy. How did you then not get lost in the art? Because I think that will then take us into asserting your power in a harmonious way, because I know that dovetails to what you were alluding to in the personal side of things. So before you go there, then how did this shift? So you started to face the junk, you started to face the pain. So how did you then reorient your art? What happened then in terms of your craft of art? Not the creative alchemy, we're not there. More in terms of still in that nitty gritty phase of the transcendence, the transfiguration.
What it did for me was when I started to surrender and embody, as in I allowed myself to feel and deal with the root causes of a lot of things, then it expanded my own creative flow. And when I also had to take a look at the sequence of events that was occurring in my life, and not only deal with them in a very 3D way, I was also having to process things like energetically, and also from an expansion of awareness, to the point that then I could say, okay, so these sequence of events are also kind of directing me more to following what my essence is almost. Would I have done it without these sequence of events occurring? Opening up in all of these ways and surrendering put me in a situation where the only thing I had left was divine trust. I had to trust when there was nothing around me that was any tangible sort of foundation. There was a period of a few months where that's all I had, and that's how I'd felt, surrender and trust. So I always knew or had a belief in something bigger, and this really pushed me to that limit. When you fully give yourself and you go, okay, and you surrender, then you're also opening yourselves up to receive more, because you are saying, I'm ready. Energetically, you're like, okay, show me and I will listen. So as I then expanded, and I had some nudges along the way to also broaden my artistic style at that time, which was focused around mandalas, and I would call these multidimensional soul mandalas. And there was always a spiritual undertone to the representation that had come through visually. When I expanded beyond that, with a little bit of encouragement and support from others around me, I then started to download and integrate what I now call the cosmic blueprints. So what was interesting was I'd always had this inkling to a detailed work visually, almost as if I'd always wanted to fully immerse the viewer in something. Like I always felt like that is something that my art is intended to do, which is why I used to like detail either drawing it, and also I'd find it engaging when I would see visual art. There was always something new to see in it, and the way that it can seep through the subconscious, because you won't mentalize visual art. It's a universal language. It's all symbolism, and that can penetrate without our mind needing to get in the way. And so in effect, that's what I had to do myself. And then I was able to birth through what I now call the cosmic blueprints. And that came from surrendering. That came from having to the point where you feel you have nothing left, and except to open up fully to the energy.
So it sounds like instead of you doing the art did you, or it came through you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a reorientation to where the energy is coming from and how it's manifesting, or how it's kind of being actualized through you as the being, so to speak.
Yeah, it was almost like fully releasing my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, to lose your mind, find your senses, as they say. And I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of application here, as I alluded to, and you know, more of my passion is to bringing this to the business realm and to business leaders. Doesn't only mean you have to be incorporated. Some of the audience already knows, visionary entrepreneurs, spiritual entrepreneurs. So I think there is a divine design, as there is. I think God, the universe, is very mathematical by design, and you exemplify it because it's, you know, as a hardcore introvert, as I alluded to, use my terminology, so to speak, to describe how you process. One would say that classic introvert is attention to detail. Mr. EJ on Myers-Briggs, you know, I had to learn to pay attention to detail. And so I would say that the work you're doing now, which I know you have a sample behind you, which we could potentially talk about later on. I think there's applications here because we talk about creative geniuses, which I would consider you one, and Silicon Valley as a joking analogy or parallel. And I think we're seeing more and more. Don't discount the traits that may seem quirky or weird, both as a person, because I think you're learning to unlock and bring them forward yourself. And I think that's the job of what I'm finding more and more, is to drill open you introverts as part of the people that I support. So I love how you're bringing this forward, because I think it's very fitting given what's going on right now, because I think this speaks to having hybrid workplaces, having people work remotely. People are going to process differently. And I think we're going to have a greater appreciation as we all kind of develop new ways of being, or become creatively alchemized, so to speak. So walk us through this transformation, and so we can get into more of what you're doing now and this concept of creative alchemy and some of those juicy things that I know that you're all about. What is this notion of asserting your power? This in a harmonious way, and then can you further that down this personal transformation? Because I think we've talked about offline before our personal styles, because I'm much more direct, confrontational, extroverted. You're much more indirect, to use my terminology, much more harmonious, or to use even another parallel verbiage, you're much more yin, I'm much more yang. There's very much a divine complementary synergy there. And I think a lot of times you calm my hot-headedness, excited nature down. Not to say you don't get passionate and excited and hot-headed. So how did you deal with this in your personal life? Because I think you touched on this earlier. A lot of times we do this. And I knew personally at a soul level, in the ancient times, they used to call it being a householder versus being a yogi. It was very difficult. And I come across this quite regularly with clients, couples married many years, coming and saying, hey, we're diverging, we're not converging. He or she, a lot of times it could be the man too. I deal with men coming out of a relationship, and it's difficult. And I think let's unpack that specifically, however you feel inspired, if you can address the power issue, because I think a lot of the synergy in our spaces, you've taught me a lot too, in terms of how to make myself more relatable, things that I think would be more of a introverted, your style and approach. So let's wrap up that transformation and then couch it with power and authority, and then your learnings on conflict and harmony through conflict, so to speak.
I feel that there's this choice point that we come to in our life, and that can also include the relational dynamics around you, or a reevaluation as to whether energetically you are still on the same path. So, you know, we each have an individual path. It's whether that person's path is alongside yours, alongside this kind of choice point. And I mean, on a like, if you were to expand the awareness to this is also talking globally about what seems to be happening and what we see, you know, this branching off with different levels of consciousness. It's a choice point. It's like, you know, unplugging from something, like we could call that the 3D matrix, plugging into something different, like a 5D lifestyle. This is the old world going into the new earth. So a choice point for me is kind of like the moment where the universe shakes you bit like a snow globe,
Mm.
and you have to decide, which path you would like to follow. Now, some personal development, if we call it that, is something that was always foremost in my mind. It's my journey has been one of wanting to learn and to integrate and to expand as much as I possibly can within the form that I have. Others don't, and that is their path. There isn't as much interest for that. People, and they're meant to be at a certain level. When you bring two people together, who one is wanting to continually expand and the other is content where they are, then it creates this kind of emotional kind of distance and an energetic distance, and then your paths tend to go like this. And obviously, when certainly when you're in a marriage, I mean, there are things that you will you do in order to maintain harmony, and certainly that's what I was doing. And me and my husband, when we met, we had a lot of things in common, and he was one of the first people I'd come across that had a spiritual awareness that was similar to mine, and who had spiritual gifts in his own right. And in some ways, because this was new and I hadn't had many people around me in that way, it was easy for me to put him on a pedestal. So straight away, I was in a situation, and this is part of my introverted nature, was to also disown my power. It was to put others on that pedestal. And I would do this very internally. And I could also then see how, when I was like looking at this, how this had also played out. So there's this person on the pedestal, and who I admired on a spiritual level, like with gifts that he had, of which I had felt I hadn't got in that way. As it turned out, I was doing it differently. So I had also passed a judgment on, it would only look like this if you're gifted in this way. So what I would do is I would listen to what he was saying and take it as gospel almost, and I would like run with it. And in a sense, what I did was I was fueling his own ego. So, move forward, when I started to work on my own gifts, and as they came through, and my own intuitive nature, I actually understood how I received information. So I realized that the judgment I passed on myself had actually been limiting the belief in myself that I had also possessed, interesting and unique gifts of communication, and everything that he was able to do, I was equally doing. When I started to turn to my own inner GPS system and my own intuition, and I had my own connection going, where actually this was at the point I was becoming more embodied, I started to notice the shift in energy, where there was, I had shifted the dynamics to an extent that it was almost, he wasn't quite sure how he had fitted into that anymore. And in some ways, I feel like I had, it would have felt to him like I had taken his power away, that he had held over me. Neither one of us really knew what to do with that. And then that played out then in when I kind of said, about the separating. It was my intention to remain really good friends with this person, my husband, and we had shared children together. So I didn't see how then, it would spin out of control almost and result in events that I hadn't foreseen coming. And one of which was by me giving my power away that I had done a disservice to our own relational dynamics, to the extent then that the demasculizing of him and the introverted nature as well of myself, and not fully expressing effectively, we'd had, like, at that point, we weren't even communicating. We were emotionally distant. I was escaping into art, being embodied, and I was becoming embodied. My expansion was increasing, and then I was seeing things differently. I was turning to myself for guidance, listening more to my own intuition, and all these cracks really started to appear, to the extent that to fix them was going to become difficult. So to try to stay in that, how I felt, would have caused more. So I decided then it would have been better to separate. What I didn't foresee was what would happen.
Well, let's pause there, because this is interesting, because I've taken a lot of notes on this, because I think you're dovetailing some really beautiful concepts of what can happen when we unknowingly give our power away. And then it's about this notion of reclaiming our power, which, alludes to theories related to the drama triangle. If you don't know about these concepts, I haven't talked about them before. So you're presenting an opportunity to bring in more holistic understanding and wisdom for leaders to employ. The Cartman trauma triangle. And if you don't know it, we end up very basically, I'm feeling inspired to draw it. Never done it here. We have a whiteboard for a reason, folks. So you basically have a triangle. You have let me do it, make sure I do it right. We'll do R to P and here. So you have a triangle, you have a rescuer personality. Sounds like he was the rescuer, you were the victim, gave your power away to a higher authority. And then quickly, when we change what I would call the dynamics of the relationship, the rescuer shifts to a persecutor. Hopefully I'm remembering my Cartman drama triangle. That then leads to different types of passive aggressive tendencies. We have, as you're alluding to, nonviolent communication would have been beautiful for you both. I know, as we've talked about personally, both professionally and personally, I had to learn to deal with this stuff and codependency and all that. So I like how you touch on that and this notion of how we give the power away and how we shift. And I think it's important to also infuse this for the audience's sake, that part of what I've come to realize, and I think the science and a lot of novel team facilitation research shows us this, that anytime you form a bond, as you've learned, Manya, you create a container. And then there's energetic chemistry, much like there would be biochemistry, and the term would be entropy. There would be a dynamics that would form in this container, in this relationship container. And so then when we shift it or shake it up, it can really change things. As I've come to learn and write about and teach upon and employ in my own personal life, and I think you're exemplifying it perfectly, is that you have to then almost rupture the system, which we go back to the nature's way of the deconstruction before we can construct. And I've made that mistake. And I think there's this comedian that I've told you about, Dion Cole, who's a newer comedian who does a great skit on his latest stand-up piece where he says a lot of times we're afraid, and it can be in intimate relationships. If you're listening, this could be in tribe. I last year was searching, hey, who are my peers? Who's my tribe? And we can settle. And I think you're hitting that point as well. And we can become complacent. And Dion Cole jokes, and he says that when we shouldn't have stopped here, we stopped and we settled. We should have kept going. And it's no disrespect to the people we meet along the way. It's to say, again, back to the theme that seems to be unpacking here, is how do we optimize creativity? How do we expand energy? How do we stifle it? How do we constrict it? How do we box it in? And then it starts to die and really atrophy. And I think that related, I know not to unpack it too much because we've talked about biophysical healing. I know we know working together.
Definitely when I'd got to the point where I was starting to energetically feel more of what was happening in our space, and I started to see where I'd been given my own power away. I started to feel that kind of stifling energy, then it led to disease and burnout, because my sort of form and my sort of 3D existence was kind of being drained from roles and responsibilities that I'd had in a relational sense, where it hadn't been the way I had expected. I expected sort of both of us to be equal components to the very everyday aspects of married life and having a home and children. What I'd found was the responsibility was falling more on me as an individual. So on a very 3D everyday life, I felt like I was being drained. And then when I was starting to see this other energy play out within my marriage, and creating like this energetic distance as well, as the paths were like this was like in addition. And then following the separation, and then the sort of behaviors that then played out to the extremes that they did. And I'm talking about my husband gaslighting me and going to the school saying I was crazy, that our children were in danger if they were in my company. And all this was based on my art and my meditation journals. And there's like all this that was playing out. And so I went into complete burnout as well. Like it completely had an effect on me where I was in disease. And so I had to also address that. And it got to that stage because I'd been ignoring the things that I really needed to sit and look at. So the universe was like really providing me a pressure cooker, and layers of things that were going on and on.
The cauldron of God's fire. We're formed and molded by it. Yeah, it's very beautiful. I love how you're breaking this down. Real quick, let's touch upon a couple quick points, because you're talking about, earlier you mentioned, and I wanted to bring it back full circle, you worked with the very people, you trained the very delinquent bullies that used to bully you. So I know I've learned, and we have reciprocal dharma and paths, so to speak. I've learned how to enhance my capacity or hold space. We've talked about this earlier on the show a few episodes ago at the beginning of the second season on the feminine principle, how to hold space. You've shown me how to contain more. And I've definitely looked at where I've become, where I was triggering out of anger, rage, and vengeance. I think that was probably my karma and my legal training plus my own karmic dissonance. So you touched on this radical personal responsibility. I mean, you're highlighting it throughout what you're discussing, and you even use the word, it's my responsibility to reclaim my power. To walk us through this tail end of, okay, shit got bad, as we say in English. And there's this sadness, right, that comes with it. There's this grieving and honoring all of these experiences. Because I think for you, what you've shown me, another big thing you've shown me, is what does divine justice mean? What is this notion of radical forgiveness? How do we deal with the very people that bullied us if we meet them later in life? How do we deal with authority handlers, which is another more woo-woo concept of dominion and exerting too much control over somebody, which is, it doesn't have to be predatory. I mean, that's extreme predatory behavior. It could be as unconscious in this trauma triangle that I drew, right? I don't think Jamie, your ex, had any ulterior motives. I think he grew up in his own intergenerational collective angst. He had his own deficiencies. He didn't do his inner work until it was too late, so to speak. God bless him. So I think, him aside, talk to us about radical forgiveness, because I think that you epitomize this. And I think you said the word harmony. I would say they're synonymous, because forgiveness is about, the way I've learned it in my training, my master's, was about bringing the system together as a whole, reuniting everybody that's been fragmented. Using apartheid South Africa is a very beautiful example of what they did there. No blame, no shame, no judgment. Let's bring everybody together and let's heal. Let all the abusers talk about the abusing they did, and all the abused talk about all the abuse they endured. How did you not churn? How did you turn the other cheek? How did you not go eye for an eye, turns the whole world blind? Because I would have gone ape shit. And I think in walking you through it, I was like, and we could talk about the family law system, maybe if we have time, and how archaic it is. And it's not built to deal with the dynamic, modern, novel relationships and all that. So talk to us about that one.
So, yeah. I mean, turning the other cheek was something that I had always done, and I had always done for the wrong reasons. And I could take it way back to my childhood.
In a healthy way, correct. That's beautifully put.
So,
let's talk about doing it.
If I talk about that, because then I can talk about, how I kind of navigated then the way that it presented itself again, and the choices that I made at this point. So when I would often turn the other cheek. So when I was bullied at school, and this would be, the comments and the singing choruses that were not nice, and I'd have people I didn't even know turn around and be like, "You're the most ugliest person I've ever seen." And I didn't know these people, and I would get things all the time about my visual appearance. And then I was also aware that, if I spoke out in a class or answered a question, the way that I was answering was also slightly unusual, or the way that I'd received the question. So there were lots of things that contributed to the introverted nature. I was always very strong with, if someone is hurting me, don't allow that person's behavior to change who I am. And I was never the person to be mean back, because it wasn't my essence. Now, then you could say I was like self-sacrificing. And these are the things I had to identify with, because then that could play into my victim mindset. And I had a lot of that going on when I had to clear
martyrdom.
out too.
You're describing martyrdom.
Yeah.
Martyrdom.
And there was this balance and harmony I had to bring to making sure I stood in my integrity, and I remained who I was in my truest nature. while at the same time standing up for myself and asserting where it mattered. So in my childhood, there was this kind of turning the other cheek coming out. All right, what presented itself in my marriage was I then ended up creating this very extreme situation where I had to suddenly defend every ounce of who I was as a person in a legal system. So the things that I was accused of were definitely untruths, in the sense that he was actually creating things against me, of which he was himself. And we're talking about our beliefs and abilities to channel his clairvoyance and medium.
I can speak to all of it, and as
so
you know,
he was downloading his own symbols and contributing to things like how we can work with the cosmic grids and light and things like this. And he was very, as I said, he was very gifted, and
I was shocked. I was shocked. He's a very gifted soul, correct?
Yeah. And so then I am doing exactly the same things. I was even before the cosmic blueprints were birthed through me, the art that I was doing, had a spiritual undertone, which then evolved into actually writing light language and things, and pulling through like further expansion of consciousness and bringing in something new. So it was very similar to his gifts. As I said, I reorientated and trusted myself more, and then all of a sudden everything got turned against me. And what he did was, within 24 hours of the separation, he was then recording us having conversations about spiritual beliefs, and discussions of like people like David Icke, for example, which had been brought into our awareness from his best friend. He was recording me talking all about these, and then he presented that as the evidence, as far as I'm aware.
So he baited you in a way.
Yeah, so he basically, yeah. Now, alongside that,
go slow. Would you say you made yourself susceptible to be baited?
Yeah, definitely.
How so? Before you continue, how so?
Yeah, okay. So I was susceptible to this because I was blindsided. I didn't see
power giving away.
And I would also kind of say this was more like the shadow self, because it wasn't in my area that I would even consider doing that. I completely missed the signs that somebody else was doing it. So I would say it was probably the third night of talking after me saying about separation, I actually cottoned on, and it took me that long, of which time he had 15 hours of audio of me talking. And it took me that long, and that it was for that reason, by me ignoring my own shadow and not seeing it in others, then I was not aware that this person would be doing something, would consider doing something like that. And then alongside that, he then had taken me for a doctor's appointment, and that was under the pretense of it being his. So he had a lot of work stress, had been off work, and that would have been 2 years prior. And I had been, obviously, my input was relevant because it was also, how it was either spilling over into family life. And so when I said I wanted to separate, within 24 hours, he was like, I'll go back to work. I won't be stressed. I'm not going to have the work stress. And he ended up turning into a completely different person. So he went back to the GP, supposedly to be saying, I'm ready to return to work, so she could edit the note that he'd been off with. And it was actually wanting my input for the sudden turnaround. And then it turned out to be an appointment for me. So within this appointment, blindsided again, he brought up my beliefs. And he brought up, light language and the sort of the symbols that I was downloading and things I'd written in my meditation journal, as evidence that I was mentally unstable or postnatally depressed, and the children were not safe with me. And that was all new. So the GP's like, speaking to me, and she'd already knew me, and cognitively at that point, I was, I may have a belief, it certainly wasn't dangerous or to myself, my health, his health, the children's. And she's like, no, she didn't agree that there was anything mentally unstable. Or anyway, a couple of weeks later, he chose to ignore the medical advice and that he had directly been given. And the next thing I know is I get a phone call from social services to speak to me directly, because he had gone to the police and he had reported me to the police. At which point, this is kind of when I was, what is going on here? Now, after all that, and then we had social worker involved. He'd been to the school already, and he'd been to my mum, and he had also spoke to my manager. So he was also at that point going and connecting with people around me to also present this information. Now, after the social worker had done their assessment within the family dynamics and concluded that there was nothing wrong, and that was based on his history in mental health services before children's social services, the conclusion was there were no safeguarding concerns, and there was concern brought to the extent he was going to, and the term which I hadn't heard of at that time was gaslighting, and also there was parental alienation coming into it, which he highlighted. So that was concluded. They weren't going to remain involved in the family. The advice was we couldn't remain cohabiting, because at this time, although we were separated, I was remaining living in the house, and I was sleeping on the sofa bed downstairs. We didn't have a spare room. So the level of the behavior patterns that were then playing out within the dynamics started to create like this toxic environment, and the social worker was like, it's not, it will cause psychological harm if you were to continue cohabiting. Both of you continue cohabiting in this house will cause damage to your children emotionally in the long term. Now, he wasn't prepared to move out, then this is obviously why we were cohabiting, and I wanted to stay for my children, and I was working part-time in order to be the main caregiver for them too, and I had nowhere else to go with them. So that's where we were at. After the social worker had said, I was trying at this point still to create harmony through the conflict, and I could appreciate I'd hurt him, and he probably would all equally say he got blindsided by my choice, because he hadn't actually seen the evidence that had led up to that. We'd even had an intervention to address the support that he needed to kind of pivot his life a little bit, obviously, that was going to spill over to positively impact our family. I'd already spoke to his family a little bit, and they actually had come and spoke to him. So after all that, and I realized then perhaps, I had blindsided him, and here we go, tit for tatting with the energy, and I'm accepting as much responsibility of what I'm creating. And I'm like, okay, the social worker has said that there's, your concerns, there are no safeguarding concerns. The children are safe with me. Of course, you know that they are, Jamie. Why are we doing this? We need to focus on being united for the sake of our children. And I was then saying, let's do mediation, let's try and find again, harmony through conflict. So here are the details, I'll contact them because we book our individual ones first, and then we can start doing joint ones. And that's where I was at. And then what happened was I got served what we call ex parte court papers in the February. So this was December time, early December. And in February,
what year?
This was the latter end of 2020, going into the beginning of this year in 2021. So I got served these court papers, and again, all of the statements in that was related to exactly the issue we've been looking at. So I'm mentally unstable. There was that I'm being groomed online. My spiritual beliefs I'm now part of a cult. So he was going to town and like wildly exaggerating to the point of making it all up. And it was exactly the same as what I had addressed recently with the social worker. This time now it was going to be in front of the judge. Now that was early Feb. And by the end of February, I'd got a second social worker call because I was still cohabiting. So at this point, he was still spying on me, not by recording. The communication had broken down and we were living very separately while cohabiting together. He was installing cameras, baby monitors. All of a sudden, our children were older than that was needed. He did that while the social worker was here. And I was like, is this necessary? And this was in the space that I was then sleeping in the evenings as well. And from knowing he had done audio recordings of me, I started to then feel into, this immense kind of monitoring side. I was like, you know, and I would hear him also question our children. What has mummy fed you today? Has mummy showered you today? What have you done? And it was almost as if anything that I was doing, you know, he was there he was trying to take photographs of me. I was, you know, making a coffee, and if I was looking at my phone, he would take a photo, because he was presenting evidence that I was lazy, unfit, neglectful. So he was really kind of like trying to catch me out in situations, and that's the environment I was living in. And alongside that, I was working part-time, which was home-based, so I was actually always within the home environment. And while I was working, that was when he would look after the children. He would then intentionally interrupt me with my meetings that I was having. He'd be constantly coming into the room. When I asked him not to, he would say, well, you know, the house is ours and this is equally my room. I'm allowed to come in and out as I please.
Yeah, it sounds like the more you continue, I mean, again, one could venture and say that a lot of this toxicity was there. It was latent, ignored, because you're talking about describing symptoms of dis-ease. I know I personally witnessed, you know, having a personal relationship with him, a friendship, you know, that went sideways very quickly, understanding that he was in distress, he had confided in me, all those things. So I get all of that. Yeah. Now talk to us, because that's a very good picture of understanding, wow, when you say dark night, this is what you're describing.
Yeah.
To let the audience
then there was the stepping into the power part, you know, which is then when I ended up having to present the case to court myself. Now, I had no legal representation or any means of really, you know, having that. So what I had to do was find my voice and counter these allegations that were made against me. And I had to, you know, pull them from a lot of external professional sources, which I was able to do on the basis that obviously there was some untruth to those. So I had the GP's letter supporting me to confirm her findings, the social worker's assessment. And I suddenly had to start saying, you know, and defending these things against what my husband was saying. And I felt very uncomfortable with having to bring that out into the open and to speak about this. I was able to, you know, when I was able to get bits of free legal advice, and this was earlier on, you know, they would say, you know, you have a lot there to look at a non-molestation order, which I'd never heard of before. So, you know, something that because of the way he was behaving at that time, you know, removing him. And there was a part of me that was like, this is the father of my children. And I don't want to create this tension. Like, I'm still wanting at this point to seek. So yes, defend myself while also maintaining my own integrity of how far I would even want that to, you know, be a label on him. If I had taken it as far as that, you know, you can't have a non-molestation order put in place and there not really be some record of it somewhere. And I didn't want that for him. And I was told I had enough at that point to pursue that. So there was this balance where I had to be assertive, defend myself, speak my truth, and at the same time ensure that I was integral to the fact that this was the father of my children. And this was despite what he was sort of doing. You know, it reached the point where I had to do that more and more and go, this is an unjust situation. I need to speak my truth and I need to present this information for myself. You know, this was part of me having to claim my power and not allow myself to self-sacrifice. And it's where that balance needed to be. And although I was being assertive and obviously regarding the system, presenting what I needed to present to defend my own character, I was also, you know, at the same time trying to create more harmony by taking that step back, you know, and part of that was, you know, one of the reasons why he wouldn't leave the property is because the property itself, you know, or the finances within that was a driving factor, and at least that's how it had come across. And
it goes back to competitiveness and
so I was like, have all of it. My only interest is that I remain a part of my children's lives, and you know, and that's what I then decided that I would look at creating going forward. So at the same time, that I experienced this. And I can say that, yes, there are aspects that come under, say, an experience of emotional abuse. I had allowed myself to have that experience in order that then I can empower myself to do something about it.
Yeah, it's a fine line, right? And as I said when I was practicing more full-time in the dispute resolution space, it's the assertion. You want to, have a assertive stance while at the same time maintaining that centeredness, that harmony within, so you're not overreacting. You're not coming from that vengeful state.
And this perspective is all obviously what I would say is a very kind of 3D perspective of the sort of situation.
Well, yeah. Well, let's.
But then there's the layers on top.
Well, we'll pause for a second. So, and then I think what's also interesting is this notion of which is very common when you see people being discredited, which is really historically this notion of people talk about expressing your truth. And a lot of the times the truth may be a novel thing, it may be an outlier. And in history, we've seen many campaigns to discredit people that brought truths that didn't conform to the existing system, to the existing hierarchies, to the existing authorities or power structures. You can get really biblical with this and say that's what happened to Jesus. You can get ancient with this and say this is what, all the mystics in the past, the witches, you can go that route and say that's what the witch burnings were people being accused. And so I think there's this notion, and we see it now, don't want to get political. Now we have it more than ever. We have a very Orwellian society where if you, God forsake, speak against the narrative, you then are discredited. So I think what we're speaking and dancing around is a great invitation for those listening, as I often do, because I've talked about this sub theme of women's empowerment and the rise of the feminine in earlier episodes of this season. And I think what we're now dancing around is, okay, now outside of feminine masculine, if you're a new earth leader, if you're a visionary, if you're coming out as a creative genius, then there may be societal pushback. Your family, in this instance, your family, your relational spouse, were then pushing back because you're also creating this dissonance within them, because as you shake up, because you're connected, it's going to shake up the entropy. And I think that's oftentimes in organizations why we see problems, because they may move a little bit of the needle down here, the higher ups, the entropy hasn't happened, the deconstruction, the inner work, the inner alchemy. So this is good, because I think that what you're exhibiting for us, or epitomizing and embodying, is that it is important for us to stay in that center, to speak our truth, to say, no, you're misrepresenting me. And I know some more of the details than what you're saying to the audience. So this is beautiful. So you've learned that. How did this then lead you to this seminal transformation of, okay, I'm going to be doing cosmic blueprints, creative alchemy? Walk us down this home stretch. And then, so let's talk and unpack what you're up to now, why it matters. Yeah.
So at this point, the catalyst that sparked this behavior was ultimately my own awakening and claiming my power, which was putting through, insights and everything that I was getting. This came through then in my art when I started doing light language. And then at this point, I hadn't fully birthed through the cosmic blueprints. There was a shift within me, and I was already becoming aware that I was accessing a lot more sort of conscious. My expansion of consciousness was starting to really, I was feeling it. I was feeling that I was getting things through that were very different. So this was the catalyst. Now, at this point, I am stepping into my power in regards to, representing myself, to speak my truth in regards to allegations being made against me. There's also what I see as two other layers happening. So the radical forgiveness, which was something that you kind of mentioned, and I'll talk about that to start with, which then led to the sort of a choice point I had to make. So when my husband was sort of doing this way, I had a very profound kind of, or doing this behavior towards me, had a very profound kind of realization that who isn't to say that it was a role he played in order to provide the environment I needed to fully step into what I'm here to do. And there is a story out there, and I can't remember who it's by. I heard it many years ago, about two little sparks of light in the sky.
Little angels.
Okay, yeah. So
I think Neil Diamond Walsh originally wrote it.
Okay.
Yeah, the
so I
founder
remember,
of founder of Conversations with God, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh,
Very
okay.
controversial extrasensory being in his own right, if you ask some of the religious communities, because they say he's a blasphemer. So anyways,
Okay.
keep going. Yeah.
So I'd heard that little story, which is, the role that a being will take in your life in order to actually catalyze you into a different direction. And I was kind of like, feeding into this, and I was like, what if that is what these people show us, which then leads into we are creating all of what we see and we experience as well. So you could say that the sequence of events that happened had to be to the extreme that they did in order to shift me from being comfortable and I'm not talking about settling in a relational dynamic, settling in life in general, and also allowing society's expectations to play a part as to how that should unfold. So when I came to making the choices that I did, as a result, of being in this situation, I also went against the conventional norm, and I decided I didn't want to survive a situation. So at that point, even when I had moved out of the family home because he wasn't going to go anywhere, and I'd felt it was becoming more toxic for the children by both of us being there, when I was at that point funding somewhere local. I obviously, as well, having left the marriage without any sort of finances, I was at that time I was providing for myself, providing for the children, and I was running out of money left, right, and center as well. At the same time, I was still buying into what suited my husband. I realized that even by removing myself, I was still playing into that dynamic in some capacity, because there was still a certain amount of allowance. And the more that I was like standing up for myself, the more resistance became apparent in the space, and in order to fully thrive, I realized I was going to have to make a choice where I stepped back even more than I would have chosen to. And the only reason I did that was because after months of experiencing it, I ended up having complete burnout, where I had to take time off work, of my part-time work, and I was still in that I was still like managing kind of that and the work. And then I realized that wasn't going to happen. And I also realized I had a choice to make, whether to pursue what I felt was my soul calling, and to start sharing more and to step into my power, because I was still feeling that I'm here to co-create something bigger, which will ultimately be in place for my children to become part of that. And to give up at that point and to remain in a situation where I was surviving and barely surviving would not have produced the results that I knew I wanted to see in co-creating the new earth, or a new world, and a world that they would then have the opportunity to live in. So I chose to thrive, and by choosing to thrive, I had to make some tough choices in order to do that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think Carlos Castaneda in The Fire Within calls that the petty tyrants, or the giants that we choose to really have show up, and that contrast, that friction brings the learning, and it's radical personal responsibility, because at a very higher dimensional level, as you're alluding to, we wrote this, we chose this, and to say that to some people is frightening. What do you mean, Haas? I chose dis-ease, I chose distress, I chose dysfunction in a marriage, I chose this really heinous process. So yeah, I love how you touch upon that, and you allude to the sacrifices we have to make that can be arduous, that can really almost kill us. And your burnout, I know, because again, we were working together, it's pretty bad. I mean, the flavor of it, do you want to describe for the audience? Because I know in other episodes, without getting too far into it, so we could turn our attention, if you feel inspired, to the technologies that you're working with now. What was your burnout like? Because I know Tanya on the first season and many others have touched on burnout. To give a flavor of when we say burnout, because it's a very amorphous word. How bad was your burnout? What were your biophysical, emotional, mental?
Yeah,
people can understand that if you ignore, you escape, you don't embody, what can happen. Yeah, give a flavor.
So my burnout was really from the shock of like the situation I found myself in. So during the time of the cohabiting, I was starting to get anxiety and panic attacks, and I was always like very tense and on edge. So that was the beginning. Before that, when I had felt like I was really holding a lot of weight of the family solo, my body was already starting to degenerate in the sense that my hair was already starting to fall out and toenails were falling off. Then during it, I had the anxiety and the panic attacks were starting to come up, of which I'd never experienced. So my body is doing one thing, and I'm able to feel it and kind of see what it was showing me, and then wondering why I couldn't keep it together in form almost, which lent itself to more awareness with what was really going on biophysically. And then with menstruation as well, and I had all sorts of blood clots and all sorts of really lovely things like that, which also manifest itself, because this is sexuality, and this was also a betrayal of, you know, that sexual component, you know, within the like a relational dynamic such as a marriage, because I was feeling betrayed and rejected, and you know, so obviously once I'd removed myself from the immediate environment, it was almost as if it allowed the space for everything to come up to show me the extent of what my body was suffering. And had I not have dealt with it, I knew I would have ended up dying. Like, it was obvious to me that I couldn't continue. And that's what I mean by surviving. So how long could I have survived in that situation? And, you know, I had others around me that were struggling to understand why I made the choices that I did, because I had to break convention. I had to break convention because I was becoming aware of my burnout, and having to stay in that situation with it in any capacity was something that I wouldn't have really got, you know, ever come out of.
Well, the oxygen mask, you know, the classic oxygen mask thing for leaders is the most important. And here we're talking about, do I leave my kids as orphans by staying, or do I, you know, become a, you know, and extradite myself from the situation so I can heal and thrive and allow in an unfettered way? Because we're talking about, you know, this power structure that I showed the audience, the triangle, that when the rescuer becomes the persecutor, then they want to then take your kneecaps out, as you're alluding to, which then becomes a problem. And this is classic in conflict. As you know, I was kind of conflict coaching you through this as best as I could. And you had some other friends along the way. So I love that you bring a lot of beautiful synergy to this, and synchronicity, I should say, to this, synthesis, let's even say, to this, because I think that's important for the audience to understand that when we say burnout, I mean, it can get pretty extreme to the point where if you don't check it. And then the other point brilliantly brought forward is, how, as a leader, do you explain to people you're not going to move forward if you don't pause? Well, Haas, I have money and you have needs, and you experience this whole, I have to pay the bills. So there's this counterintuitiveness that you're also bringing up that we've touched upon in other episodes. And I know is very much what I teach, show, and is the only leaders that can make it through and do what they need to do to get out of it, and have the breakthroughs that I can show them, is what you're describing, is the ones that actually go, oh, I need to stop, pause, still, and unpack in order to heal, step back into this homeostasis, harmony, and then thrive. So where do you want to take?
I really don't feel like I would have even got through that process if I didn't have some really good support people, you know, around me. So I had people that were not of the same sort of thinking as me. They remained supportive in the way that they could. And then I had like yourself, that was already had this higher awareness of things, which was also, you know, of a great support. And I think this is one of the key things, is that when people see a leader and they only see that leadership side, there can be this illusion that we haven't had to go through these experiences too, where then the audience don't feel like they can relate to us, which is one of the things that I love about the Vulnerable Power Show, because part of being the leader is also being relatable to the journey, to others and the journey that they're on, and to be able to say, well, do you know what, I can really appreciate the journey that you have created for yourself, and this is why, because some of that is like a reflection of mine too, and I can relate. And this vulnerability aspect is actually very important so other people can see that there is this other side to leaders. There's this other side that gets presented in those moments where they're sharing expertise. It's also a process and a journey that we've all had to go through too, and that therefore they're not alone, because to feel alone when you're going through something like that, it is it's tough, and it's important people know that there are people to support them along the way.
Beautifully put. Pearls from the pain. So what are the pearls that you're up to now? Talk to us, because you're talking about the expertise comes from the experience, and we go through these transformations. We go through this arduousness. And one of my friends said it best: the cauldron of fire sculpts us. This was a buddy of mine who helped me while I was sued by a client in the middle of my dark night 4 years ago. And it was this like heinous, horrendous shit show of an experience. And when we met, you said, Haas, when things were starting to transpire the way you've described them, you called it the hot mess express. And I said, you want to see a hot mess, the grass is always greener. I was in a mess, and this beautiful friend of mine, God bless him, and a fellow attorney who was helping me through this, supporting me through this, said, and I quote, he said, the cauldron of fire is what sculpts us. And so I'm glad that you're epitomizing that. So talk to us about Creative Alchemy. Talk to us about what you're up to now, cosmic blueprints, and some of the creative genius that you're bringing into form.
So I'd love to. So the cosmic blueprints, which is what is actually above me here, what I'm now blessed to be able to share is that for those that are ready to remove themselves from that sort of very conventional system, so let's call that like the 3D matrix, to unplug from almost like mass consciousness as they start to question more, then I'm able to redirect them to what would be their source point. So in other words, then they are connected to their truest essence, where they become less looking for external validation and less plugged into somebody else's system, because ultimately that is what's happened. It's plug into your own system. So it's this pivot point. And the cosmic blueprint contains a lot of light-coded technology where elements are coming together. So they actually are presented, and there's this one above me, which is why I'm putting my hand here. There is like 3 multi-layers that have come through in these cosmic blueprints. So there's like some of the drawing is in black, some is in gold, and some is in silver, because it's creating this multi-layered effect of dimensional lessons that were learned in a lifetime. So the size of these kind of like some of these shapes is actually dependent on the significance of the lessons learned in that lifetime. Each kind of one of the little tiny dot circles is kind of a choice point that was made. Each line reflects like the line, interconnecting lines is a karmic lesson that has carried over. Now, each layer in itself will create a different kind of shape if you were to zone out and only see the dark, or only see the silver or the gold. And then there's crystals also here which support the energy of the cosmic blueprint, and then alongside that we have essential oils that are also merged in. The background color is a representation of the essence of the soul. So this is like looking at the soul and monadic rays of the essence of the being that is within this kind of avatar. And then there's also some light language here, which is also an additional thing that is connecting people to their own source point. And so what this is unlocking the door. It's unlocking the door to allow further remembrance of who they are, their gifts and their purpose, to have an access point to come through. In addition, then obviously then we look at the actual process of creative alchemy, made up of the 3 pillars: imagination, visualization, and innovation.
Well, before we get there, let's pause.
Yeah.
So, okay, so what you're explaining to me, the way I understand it, and when we've talked about it before, the way I interpret it, and to kind of help unpack this for those that may be completely new to this information, maybe some very ascended beings. So we're addressing now higher levels of consciousness, this notion of David Hawkins' work, which I've alluded to, and then as you raise in consciousness, as you raise in vibration, because we're energetic beings that at a subatomic level are oscillating into different dimensions and different timelines. So we have the space time continuum. So we have multidimensionality, which is space, and we have multiversality, which is time. So you have a lot of different things going on there. So it sounds like what you're talking about is because we're energetic beings, and as we descend, we become physical, and this suit is a representation. So what am I understanding is correct? This is almost an encapsulation of your energy at a higher level. So while on the show, we've talked about human design, gene keys, some novel thought leaders that the last 20, 30 years have put forth systems, technologies to understand at a soul or pure energetic level, which science is converging on. I've alluded to some of this research before. We talked about it with William on the consciousness. And now we're seeing with the proliferation of plant medicine, we had Tim Leary, Ram Dass did this in the 80s and 70s. Now we're seeing it at a whole nother cutting edge level that, whoa, beyond our physical reality, there's a greater reality, a greater subtle reality, which has higher dimensional components, multiversal components. So you're basically putting all that in. So now how does that, because you said it helps the person, break that down a little bit and tie it to the creativity, and then walk us through those words. I think you said they were your pillars or something.
So so the first thing to mention is this is like a snapshot of somebody's cosmic essence, because it can be infinite. So what I'm capturing is the part that holds the most resonance for them in this lifetime. So it's bringing down what would support their journey here in order to step into who they really are outside of the 3D construct, and step into their own gifts and then their own mission and purpose. So specifically for people who have suddenly had this awareness, like this awakening of questioning things a little bit more, and even questioning who they are, they may have this sense of, I feel like I'm here to do something, and then they can't quite, like, it's kind of like eludes them slightly. So it's basically ensuring that or supporting their connection so that they can allow all this to come through. It's like the key.
So hold on. So it seems like it's communicating to what I would call their supra or their higher consciousness and their subconsciousness or their basement. So is that accurate? So in that way, it's activating their consciousness field and their inner energy systems and their awareness.
So there is sort of specific things that happen from obviously looking at the piece that resonates with your soul, because these are all unique to the individual. All of these are completely customized. So you will either, literally, if you're sensitive to energy, you will feel a vibrational response because your soul will resonate with it to that extent that there will be a biophysical reaction. And then if you're less sensitive, then it will be through a more relaxed state, such as like in meditation or sleeping, or where your subconscious will start opening up and more remembrance of things will come through, and more, it will ignite or spark a sudden interest within you to look at something or pursue something, because it's supporting your remembrance of gifts you naturally have.
I love that. So segue this then to Creative Alchemy, because I interrupted you. So you were saying Creative Alchemy and then 3 things. So unpack that. How does this interplay?
So the soul is obviously looking at the essence of the being is like on this kind of like slightly bigger scale. The significance of it being through art is that art is a universal language, and our mental side doesn't go quite as crazy. Like it allows things to go through when you're seeing
and be absorbed, correct?
And be absorbed and integrated.
And that's what allows it to integrate even at a subatomic and light activations. Keep going, unpacking some technology.
So yeah, so this is like the visual art that supports the kind of overarching 3 pillars of creative alchemy, which is imagination, innovation, and visualization. So imagination that we touched on, and I gave this example of how often we create from what already is existing. Because, you know, throughout society, we may have experienced where our imagination had been shut down for various reasons, or why we were not owning our own creative power. So imagination is from the heart center, looking at, you know, what blocks are in the way that has actually created our limitations in our own belief. So that's the spark, and kind of comes from the heart center. And then we have visualization, which is the mental. So the visualization is obviously bringing our awareness to our own constructs that we are having all the time, because we create every second of the day from a thought. So it's becoming aware of how to use that in the most effective and optimal way. And then we have the innovation, which refers to the body. It's how we then transform the imagination, the visualization, into a reality. So this then is to do with the body, like how are we going to now express this outwardly? And a lot of the creative alchemy work is centered around where these blocks have shown up, where we aren't fully allowing the energy to flow, where we stop ourselves through conditioning, through limiting beliefs. Are we still tapped into another person's grid? Like, how much are we feeding another person's dream? You know, and then
which makes sense given what you're talking about.
Own creator, yeah. So then it's supporting the journey to step into being their own creator and claiming their own power.
That's awesome. I think we're going to have to bring you back for a fuller escapade on creative alchemy in season 3. I think that season 2 is going to wrap up on this. I mean, you've heard his story. Now you're hearing her story, and we've had a lot of this theme, and beautiful to now incorporate this multidimensionality, this multiversality. Is there anything else at this time to kind of wrap up on the concept of creative alchemy and what you're up to and why it matters to you in terms of your mission, and how all of this arduous stuff you've gone through, why does this matter to you? Why now? Why? There's anything on those points to kind of bring us to the stretch?
Well, for me now, the significance is really this turning point, which I have felt like energetically, globally, this huge shift. So it's kind of this choice point where we buy into an existing paradigm. We're buying into somebody else's creation of what they're telling us, compared to the choice of creating something new, co-creating something new, something better than we could have ever imagined before, that comes out of a very destructive and fearful source. So you can either, you know, be buying into that or pivoting. And what I feel like I'm here to do is to support those that are ready to do that pivot, ready to step into co-creating, you know, the heaven on earth, so to speak. It's removing you from this matrix and going, let's create something different over here, which encompasses more higher dimensionality, more light frequencies. And then creative alchemy is that process that can support the journey, not only for individuals. I also work with teams as well, and look at team synergy and how to like bring all that together within the team so that it's focused to a joint kind of vision or outcome. And I've always been very passionate to incorporate or to utilize the gift of art that has followed me, and now I feel, you know, very blessed to be able to show how effective it can be. And I can see clearly, you know, how people have blocks there that are stopping the full transfiguration to take place, because quite often people and clients say to me, you know, they've done other things and it hasn't stuck, you know, like it's not consistent. Okay, then there's a reason why. And what I want is for people to have an easeful and harmonious, consistent experience of joyful living, or bringing in what they would like. To get there requires an aspect of dissolving and destroying the ego self. Yeah.
What are the ways you help them pivot? Because you say you help them pivot. What are the ways you do that? you can give the...
I help them to be able, I bring awareness to things where they've been blocked or where their limiting beliefs are showing up.
Are there categories, for instance, that you help them pivot? Are there like topics? Is it like in their business, for instance?
So, well, within the business area, that's more like where the energy is going as the team, like where are they seeping it out elsewhere? And that normally is because they aren't pulling together, and it's bringing their awareness to the significance of that, so that there is this joint vision happening. Using Creative Alchemy, we look at the power words that the team have, and we look at also colors that would represent that synergy. And then we look at symbols and codes that could represent that visually, so that the synergy of the team is like all going to the same place for the outcome. For individuals, it's obviously identifying the blocks and repetitive patterns. It's a little bit like, where are you looping? Because if it's not consistently in your life, the changes you want to see, there's a loop, there's a pattern that is playing out. So before we can move forward with how we harness the creative flow, utilizing it, we have to identify where the blocks were. And that comes from an analysis of taking them to bring their awareness to repetitive lessons, things that are showing up, experiences that seem to repeat. So I want to get them off the carousel and actually walk off in a different direction.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Thank you.
Anything else in terms of Creative Alchemy to wrap up?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, I am very grateful. Thank you for inviting me onto the show. I absolutely love it.
An honor.
And as a special offer for your audience, I would love to, if they approach me through you, to let me know, and I can give them a special offer on my packages.
You're giving a VPS special? You're doing a
I am giving a
special?
VPS special. So as long as they ensure that they let me know that they have come to me through the Vulnerable Power Show, then yes, there will be a special offer for your audience.
Cool. That sounds awesome. So I love to wrap up. And you're welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your light. And I have a feeling we're going to bring you back season 3 to unpack some more and dive deeper into what you're doing, what we're both doing that overlaps, and the synergy of what we're developing together. Do you have any parting words or quote to leave the audience?
I have a quote that I could leave your audience with. Yes. It's from Albert Einstein. And he says that logic will get you from A to B, and imagination takes you everywhere.
Imagination takes you everywhere. Well, Manya, it has been a treat. I think we've covered themes that have reverberated throughout the show. If you're a regular listener since the first season, coming to the home stretch of what is now the second season and wrapping it up. It's been a powerful season, having a lot of potent leaders, and to end it and come to the tail end with somebody like Manya. Manya, thank you for not only sharing your story, for being a guiding example for many. That I think Mother Teresa said it best, that, you know, when you try to do good, others may challenge you, do good anyways. And I think that you embody that, and you've given a lot of different things for our audience to think about. And above all else, like she said, that imagination can take you everywhere. And we're here, and it's very much the theme of the show, and in line with what Manya is doing with Creative Alchemy and the technologies that she's birthing through by way of the Cosmic Blueprint and some others, that anything is possible. It's us that put a hindrance on it. So if you're suffering in your leadership, if you're suffering in your personal life, take a look at it as she invited you to, and as I have in other episodes, as to what is it that you're creating? How can you take responsibility? How can you reignite that creative power, as Manya talks about, and reclaim that power in a harmonious way? And how can you contribute to doing your part to ending these cycles of power abuses, of victim rescuer dynamics, and all sorts of other things? And as she said, to unplug us from that carousel. And that's the point. So as always, if you liked what you heard here today, share it, because you'll be doing your part in serving a collective mission. Go back, check out the other episodes, subscribe, check out Manya's information, which will be below. And as she said, reach out to her if it resonates. And please do mention, as she offered here, that you came through the show, and see what is in store when you tap into your soul level and access that creative alchemy. Manya, thank you as always, and much love and blessings to everybody in the audience. Until next time, I'm Hastadegi. This has been Manya Welch. Thank you for joining us for the Vulnerable Power Show. Bye.